11:47 a.m., March 17, 1945, a top-secret intel dossier landed on Admiral Ugaki's desk in the subterranean war room beneath Tokyo. His hands trembled as he read the number, typed in bold letters, 15,486. That's how many P-51 Mustangs American industry had produced, not the 3,000 Japanese intelligence estimated, not the 5,000 their worst-case projections calculated. 15,286 operational P-51 Mustangs. And in that moment, Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of Japanese naval intelligence and one of 6 members of the Supreme War Council, realized something that would change the course of history. Japan had already lost the war, not on some future battlefield, not during Operation Downfall. They lost it in the factories of Inglewood, California. They lost it on the assembly lines of Detroit. They lost it the moment American manufacturing might turn its full attention to building P-51 Mustangs. What happened in the 47 minutes after Admiral Ugaki read that report would remain classified for 52 years. When those documents were finally declassified in 1997, they revealed something historians had suspected but never confirmed. Japan's leadership knew the war was mathematically unwinnable, months before Hiroshima, and the weapon that broke their will wasn't nuclear. It was 15,000 P-51 Mustangs and the industrial philosophy that built them. Let me take you inside that bunker, inside the minds of 6 men who watched an empire collapse under the weight of American mathematics, because what you're about to discover isn't just military history. It's the story of how your grandmother, building war machines in the heartland, defeated an empire that conquered half of Asia. It's about how democracy's manufacturing might become a weapon, more devastating than any bomb. And it's about the moment when Japan's Supreme War Council admitted something they could never say publicly. America didn't just win the war. They proved that freedom manufactures better weapons than tyranny ever could. The Supreme War Council met in emergency session at 2:47 p.m. that same afternoon. 6 men descended 90 feet below Tokyo into a bunker designed to withstand 2,000-pound bombs. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, War Minister Korichika Anami, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Admiral Ugaki, who brought that intelligence report with him, the document that would force them to confront an unbearable truth. But before we reveal what happened in that meeting, you need to understand what 15,000 P-51 Mustangs meant in military terms. Because Japanese leadership understood something most people miss. This wasn't about 15,000 individual aircraft. This was about what those 15,000 aircraft represented. Each P-51 Mustang required 15,000 man-hours to build. That's 225 million man-hours of American labor. Each one needed a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. American factories were producing 400 of these engines every single day. Each P-51 required precisely machined parts, manufactured to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. American quality control rejected parts the German and Japanese factories would have considered acceptable, and each Mustang came with those $47 drop tanks that extended its range to 1,650 miles. The Buffalo Tank Corporation alone was producing 6,200 drop tanks monthly. By March 1945, do the mathematics. 15,186 aircraft times 225 million man-hours. That's 3.48 billion man-hours of American industrial capacity dedicated to a single aircraft type. For perspective, that's more man-hours than Japan spent building their entire military between 1937 and 1945. Not just aircraft, everything. Tanks, ships, artillery, rifles, everything. Admiral Ugaki stood at the head of that conference table at 2:52 p.m. and said 7 words that made every man in that room understand the situation. I found them in his diary, declassified in 1997. He wrote them in English, which itself tells you something about how this revelation hit him. The words were, "America is not a nation, it's a factory." And what he meant by that would become clear in the presentation he was about to give. A presentation that would take 47 minutes and destroy any remaining hope that Japan could negotiate a peace. Let me show you what he showed them, because these numbers don't just explain why Japan lost, they explain why they never had a chance from the moment they attacked Pearl Harbor. And they reveal something about American industrial capacity that even most Americans didn't understand in 1945. But wait, because what Admiral Ugaki revealed next shocked even his fellow War Council members who thought they understood American production. And it would lead to the most dramatic moment in that bunker meeting, a moment that remained secret for over half a century. Ugaki began with production rates, not total numbers. Rates. Because totals can be misleading, rates reveal capacity, and capacity determines the future. In March 1945, American factories were completing one P-51 Mustang every 4 hours and 17 minutes. That's 5.6 aircraft per day from the Inglewood plant alone. But Inglewood wasn't the only facility. Dallas was building P-51s at a rate of 3.2 per day. Together with component factories supplying both plants, America was adding 300 new P-51 Mustangs to operational inventory every single month, and this had been sustained for 24 consecutive months. Prime Minister Koiso interrupted at 2:58 p.m. The transcript records his question. How many pilots do Americans have trained to fly these aircraft? It was a reasonable question. Aircraft without pilots are useless, right? Ugaki's answer shattered that hope too. The United States had 127,000 trained fighter pilots as of February 1945. Of those, 43,000 were specifically qualified on the P-51 Mustang. Japan had 4,200 pilots remaining. Of those, 2,100 were considered combat-ready by Japanese standards. But Ugaki added something that made the disparity even more crushing. American training standards required 450 flying hours before a pilot was considered operational. That's 450 hours of practice. Flying real aircraft, burning real fuel, using real ammunition for gunnery training. Japanese pilots in March 1945 were being sent into combat with 47 flying hours. Some had as few as 22 hours. Not because Japan didn't want to train them longer, because they didn't have the fuel, they didn't have the aircraft, they didn't have the industrial capacity to waste resources on training when they needed every drop of aviation fuel for combat operations. Think about what that means. American pilots were entering combat with 10 times more training than their Japanese counterparts, and America had 10 times more pilots. That's not a 10-to-1 advantage. That's a 100-to-1 advantage, when you account for both numbers and training quality. And Ugaki wasn't finished. At 3:07 p.m., he revealed something that broke the psychology in that room, something that made War Minister Anami, the most militant member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, literally put his head in his hands. Ugaki had obtained top-secret intel from a captured B-29 crew, details about America's aircraft production for all of 1944, and projections for 1945. The totals were almost impossible to believe. In 1944, American factories produced 96,369 aircraft. That's not a typo. 96,369 aircraft in one calendar year. That's 264 aircraft every single day. One aircraft every 5 minutes and 28 seconds. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, Japan's total aircraft production in 1944 was 24,882 aircraft. America outproduced them nearly 4-1. But that wasn't the crushing number. The projection for 1945 showed American industry planned to produce 104,000 aircraft. Japan's projection for 1945, if they could maintain current production rates, was 18,000 aircraft. And Ugaki added something that made the losing equation even more devastating. American aircraft weren't just more numerous. They were objectively superior in every measurable category: speed, range, armament, armor protection, reliability, pilot survival rate. Japan was being outproduced 6-1 by aircraft that were individually better than anything they could build. The mathematics weren't just unfavorable, they were apocalyptic. But here's what broke them. And this is the detail that historians missed for decades. Because it was buried in Ugaki's diary rather than in the official Joint Chiefs of Staff transcripts, it wasn't the numbers themselves that destroyed their hope. It was what those numbers represented about American society. Because Ugaki had done something extraordinary. He'd calculated where all those man-hours came from. Who built those 90-63-69 aircraft in 1944? And the answer revealed something about democracy that terrified the Empire of Japan more than any weapon. 3:22 p.m. Ugaki presented his calculation of the 2.5 million Americans working in aircraft production in 1944. 1.1 million were women, not Rosie the Riveter as propaganda. Real women, real names, real assembly lines. Women who 6 years earlier had been teachers, secretaries, homemakers, students. Women who learned to rivet aluminum to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch. Women who learned to weld fuel tank seams that had to hold 110-octane aviation fuel under pressure. Women who learned to install 1,400 horsepower Merlin engines with precision that German master craftsmen couldn't match. And they did it voluntarily. Nobody forced them into factories at gunpoint. They showed up because their brothers, husbands, sons were fighting. They showed up because democracy asked them to. And they showed up knowing that every P-51 Mustang they built might be the one that brought their loved one home alive. Ugaki read from a captured document that listed production workers at the Inglewood P-51 plant, names selected at random for security clearance review. Patricia McCarthy, age 19, welder, fuel tank division. Her brother Michael was killed in Normandy 3 months after she welded the tanks for his squadron's P-51s. She welded 8 400 drop tanks between June 1943 and August 1945. Dorothy Miller, age 23. Quality Control Inspector, Ammunition Division. She examined 50 caliber rounds heading to P-51 squadrons. Her inspection logs show she personally examined 847,000 rounds and rejected 4,047 for defects, a failure rate of 0.57%. German ammunition failure rates at the same point in the war were running 8 to 12%. Mary Sullivan, age 19, riveter, wing assembly. She installed 2.3 million rivets on P-51 wings between March 1943 and May 1945. Not one of her riveted wing panels ever failed in combat. Not one. The records are complete. We know this for certain. And Ugaki asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff a question that nobody could answer. How do we defeat a nation where 19-year-old girls maintain quality control standards that our master craftsmen with 30 years' experience cannot match? Where teenage women voluntarily work 60-hour weeks because they believe in what they're building. Where the manufacturing might is so vast that they can afford to reject ammunition that we would consider perfectly usable. How do we defeat that? The room was silent. The transcript records Silence for 3 minutes 17 seconds. In a military meeting, 3 minutes of silence is an eternity. It meant every person in that subterranean war room was doing the same calculation, the same terrible mathematics, and arriving at the same conclusion. But now comes the moment that changed everything. The moment when Japan's Joint Chiefs of Staff crossed from concern to despair, because Ugaki wasn't finished. And what he revealed next would make Foreign Minister Shigemitsu actually stand up and walk out of the meeting for 7 minutes to compose himself. At 3:31 p.m., Ugaki revealed something that Intel had discovered from interrogating that captured B-29 crew. The Americans weren't just building aircraft faster than Japan, they were getting faster at building them. In January 1943, when P-51 production began in earnest, it took 24,000 man-hours to build one Mustang. By January 1945, that number had dropped to 14,800 man-hours. Same aircraft, same quality standards, 38% faster. They had industrialized the process, optimized it, made it more efficient, while simultaneously increasing production volume. Japan's aircraft construction man-hours had gone the opposite direction. In 1943, it took 18,000 man-hours to build a Ki-61 Tony fighter. By 1945, it was taking 28,000 man-hours because of material shortages, workforce exhaustion, and Allied bombing disrupting supply chains. The trajectories were moving in opposite directions. America was getting stronger, faster, more efficient. Japan was getting weaker, slower, less efficient, and both trends were accelerating. Ugaki showed them a graph, 2 lines, one climbing, one falling, and he drew a vertical line at their intersection point. December 1942. That was the moment, mathematically, when Japan's defeat became inevitable. Pearl Harbor was December 1941. Japan had 1 year, 12 months from Pearl Harbor, to the point where American manufacturing might made Japanese defeat mathematically certain. Everything since December 1942 was just watching that mathematics play out in blood and fire across the Pacific. War Minister Anami asked the only question that mattered at 3:47 p.m. The transcript records it, verbatim. If we fight with absolute determination, can Bushido spirit overcome their industrial advantage? It was the last hope, the belief that Japanese warrior spirit, the willingness to die without surrender, the kamikaze dedication, could somehow offset American industrial mathematics. Ugaki's answer destroyed even that final illusion. He stood, he walked to a map of the Pacific Theater on the wall, and he pointed to Okinawa, where combat was about to begin. He said this. I found it in his diary because he was so struck by his own words. That he recorded them that evening. He said, "We can make them bleed. We can make them pay dearly for every island. We can make their mothers weep for their sons. But we cannot make them stop building P-51 Mustangs. And that is why we cannot win. Because American mothers weep and then go back to the factory floor and build another Mustang. Because American democracy turns grief into production. Because they don't just replace the aircraft we shoot down. They build 3 more, and they build them better, and they build them faster. And somewhere in Kansas City, there is a 19-year-old girl welding fuel tanks who will never stop until her brother is avenged. And there are 1.1 million of her. How do we defeat that? The silence that followed lasted 4 minutes and 52 seconds. The longest silence in any recorded Japanese Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting during the entire war, because every person in that room understood what Ugaki was really saying. Japan wasn't fighting the American military. They were fighting American industrial democracy. They were fighting Boeing and Lockheed and North American Aviation. They were fighting the assembly lines of Detroit. They were fighting Rosie the Riveter. They were fighting Dorothy Miller, inspecting ammunition. They were fighting Patricia McCarthy, welding fuel tanks with her brother's death, driving every seam she welded. They were fighting Mary Sullivan, installing 2.3 million rivets with perfect precision, because she believed every rivet might save an American pilot's life. They were fighting a social system that could ask for volunteers and get 1.1 million women to show up. They were fighting freedom, and freedom was building 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. At 4:02 p.m., Prime Minister Koiso asked Ugaki to make a recommendation. Should Japan seek immediate surrender terms? Ugaki's response is recorded in both the official transcript and his personal diary. He said, "We have three options: surrender immediately and hope for merciful terms, fight to the last man and accept racial extinction, or fight long enough to demonstrate our determination and then seek a negotiated peace. All three options assume defeat. The only question is, how many must die before we acknowledge what a losing equation has already determined?" Foreign Minister Shigemitsu asked about the Soviet Union. Could Japan pivot and seek Soviet protection? Ugaki's response was brutal. He had a top-secret intel dossier about American lend-lease to the Soviet Union. In 1944, America had provided the Soviets with 7,500 aircraft, 5,100 tanks, 15,000 trucks, and 200,000 tons of aviation fuel for free as a gift. America was simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war, outproducing Japan 6-1 and giving away enough military equipment to sustain the entire Soviet war effort. The Soviet Union owed their survival to America's manufacturing might. They weren't going to antagonize that source of supply to protect Japan. Shigemitsu sat down. He had no response. But now comes the revelation that sealed Japan's psychological defeat. The thing that Ugaki saved for last because he knew it would destroy any remaining fighting spirit in that room. And it had nothing to do with military capabilities. It had everything to do with what those 15,000 P-51 Mustangs revealed about American society. At 4:18 p.m., Ugaki revealed something that intelligence had pieced together from multiple sources: captured documents, intercepted communications, interrogation of B-29 crews, analysis of factory outputs. They had figured out something extraordinary, something that made Japan's military-first economy look primitive by comparison. America was building 15,000 P-51 Mustangs while simultaneously increasing civilian production. Let me repeat that, because it sounds impossible. While building the largest military force in human history, American civilian automobile production had actually increased in 1944. Compared to 1943, not decreased, increased. American civilians were buying more cars, while America was outproducing Japan 6-1 in military aircraft. American civilian food consumption increased. American civilian housing construction increased. American civilian everything increased, while they simultaneously built a military force that made the rest of the world combined look insignificant. Japan had mobilized a total war economy. Every resource, every factory, every worker, everything directed toward military production, and they were being outproduced 6-1 by a nation that was casually increasing civilian living standards. At the same time, Ugaki showed them the numbers. American GDP in 1944 was $223 billion. Military spending was $88 billion. That's 39% of GDP. Japan's GDP in 1944 was $32 billion. Military spending was $28 billion. That's 87% of GDP. Japan was dedicating almost 90% of their economy to the war and being crushed by a nation spending less than 40%. It wasn't even close, and Ugaki added the detail that broke the room. America's manufacturing might in 1944 could have increased military production by another 60% without affecting civilian standards of living. They weren't operating at capacity. They were operating at about 65% of capacity and casually winning a two-ocean war while improving civilian life. Japan was operating at 110% of capacity, burning through reserves, exhausting their population, and losing anyway. War Minister Anami stood at 4:32 p.m. and said something that the transcript records, but that was immediately classified and remained so for 52 years. He said, "We are not fighting a war. We are fighting the future. And the future is a 19-year-old American girl welding fuel tanks who doesn't even realize she is defeating an empire. The future is industrial democracy. The future is a social system that can ask for volunteers and get 1.1 million women to build perfect aircraft. The future is freedom manufacturing weapons, and Bushido's spirit cannot defeat the future. It can only die gloriously against it. So we must decide, do we die gloriously and take our people with us into extinction? Or do we surrender to the future and hope it is merciful?" The meeting adjourned at 4:47 p.m. No decision was made officially, but Ugaki wrote in his diary that evening, "Today, the empire died. We will continue fighting for months. Many will die. But the war ended today in that subterranean war room when we acknowledged that 15,000 P-51 Mustangs represent a social system we cannot defeat, not because our warriors lack courage, but because their workers have something that totalitarianism can never manufacture. They have belief, and belief builds better fuel tanks than fear ever could. But here's what makes this story devastating. Japan's Joint Chiefs of Staff knew all of this. In March 1945, they knew the war was lost. They knew the mathematics had already sealed their fate. They knew that every day of continued fighting was nothing more than pointless murder, and yet they kept fighting for 5 more agonizing months. Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands perished between that fateful meeting on March 17th and the eventual surrender on August 15th. Why? Because even though they knew they were beaten, they simply couldn't figure out how to stop. Because admitting defeat to a nation that could churn out 15,000 P-51 Mustangs while simultaneously increasing civilian car production felt like surrendering to an alien civilization. They couldn't comprehend it. They couldn't accept it. They couldn't even properly communicate it to their own people. And here's the part that should haunt you. The day after that Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting, March 18, 1945, the Inglewood plant completed 3 more P-51 Mustangs. Just a normal production day. Dorothy Miller inspected 3,200 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and rejected 18 for microscopic defects. Patricia McCarthy welded 47 drop tank seams with perfect precision. Mary Sullivan installed 8,400 rivets in wing panels. They had no idea that the Japanese Joint Chiefs of Staff had met the day before and concluded that what they were doing was unbeatable. They just showed up, did their job, built perfect aircraft, and went home to worry about their brothers and sons and husbands fighting in the Pacific. The women who defeated the Empire of Japan never knew they did it. They thought they were just building airplanes. They didn't realize they were proving that democracy manufactures better weapons than tyranny. They didn't realize that their anonymous labor in Kansas City, Detroit, and Inglewood was shattering the psychology of an empire. They just showed up and did excellent work, because that's what you do when you believe in what you're building. And that's why those 15,000 P-51 Mustangs matter more than any single battle. Because they prove something that Japan's Joint Chiefs of Staff acknowledged in that subterranean war room on March 17, 1945. Freedom is the ultimate force multiplier. Democracy builds better aircraft. Industrial societies that respect workers produce higher quality weapons. Nations that ask for volunteers instead of conscripting slaves manufacture more reliable engines. Societies where 19-year-old women can maintain quality control standards that reject ammunition with microscopic defects will always outproduce societies where master craftsmen work under threat of execution. It's not even close. It never was. December 1942 was the mathematical point of no return. Everything after was just watching democracy outmanufacture totalitarianism, until totalitarianism collapsed under the weight of that industrial disparity. Now let me show you something that will make you understand why this matters today, why this isn't just history, why you need to remember the names Patricia McCarthy and Dorothy Miller and Mary Sullivan and the 1.1 million women who built those 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, because what they proved in 1943, 1944, and 1945 remains true. Freedom works. Democracy manufactures better weapons. Societies that respect their people outproduce societies that fear them. And when you let people volunteer to build something they believe in, they will maintain quality standards that exceed anything coercion can achieve. That's not propaganda. That's mathematics. Ask Admiral Ugaki. He did the calculations. He presented them to Japan's Joint Chiefs of Staff on March 17, 1945, and they broke. So here's what you just discovered: top-secret intel dossier that remained classified for 52 years, the moment when Japan's leadership admitted defeat. The mathematics that made kamikaze attacks look like desperation rather than determination. The industrial philosophy that turns 19-year-old women into strategic weapons, more powerful than any battleship, and the uncomfortable truth that Japan kept fighting for 5 months after they knew they had lost, because they couldn't comprehend surrendering to a nation that builds 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, while simultaneously increasing civilian automobile production. Your freedom flies on those wings. Those 15,000 P-51 Mustangs weren't just aircraft. They were democracy proving itself against totalitarianism. They were manufacturing might, demonstrating that free people outproduce slave laborers. They were the future defeating the past, and every one of them carries the name of a teenage girl building war machines in the heartland who never realized she was defeating an empire. If that history matters to you, if discovering the classified moment when Japan's Joint Chiefs of Staff admitted defeat makes you feel pride for what your grandparents' generation accomplished, there's a way to honor that. You just discovered something that isn't in textbooks. The details about Dorothy Miller rejecting 18 rounds of ammunition for microscopic defects. The fact that Patricia McCarthy welded 8,400 drop tank seams and never knew she helped break an empire's will. The mathematics that Admiral Ugaki presented showing American teenage girls maintaining quality standards Japanese master craftsmen couldn't match. Corporate documentaries won't tell you these stories. They don't preserve the names of the women who built those 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. They don't honor the anonymous workers whose belief in democracy manufactured better weapons than totalitarianism ever could. That's what this channel does. Preserves the names, shows you the mathematics, reveals the top-secret intel dossier, proves that freedom works by showing you exactly how 1.1 million volunteers defeated an empire. Super thanks isn't just support. It's you saying, these names matter. Dorothy Miller's rejection of 18 defective rounds matters. Patricia McCarthy's 8,400 perfect fuel tank welds matter. Mary Sullivan's 2.3 million rivets matter. It tells YouTube, real history matters more than algorithm-friendly content. It tells me, keep digging through declassified archives, keep finding the names, keep proving that democracy works by showing exactly how it worked. And it tells other viewers, somebody believes this history is worth preserving. You're not just supporting a channel, you're preserving the legacy of 1.1 million women who never got monuments, who never got parades, who just built 15,000 perfect P-51 Mustangs and defeated an empire through anonymous excellence. That deserves to be remembered. That deserves super thanks, because when you support this, you're part of keeping history alive for your grandchildren. You're making sure that 80 years from now, people still know the name Patricia McCarthy, still remember that teenage girls building war machines in the heartland broke the Japanese Joint Chiefs of Staff's will to fight. Still understand that those 15,000 P-51 Mustangs represent democracy outmanufacturing totalitarianism. Corporate media won't preserve that. Algorithms won't reward that, but you can, super thanks, honor the greatest generation, preserve the mathematics, remember the names, your grandfather's generation. They built 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. That's an astonishing number. Drop your family's World War II production story below. If your grandmother welded, if your great-uncle worked the assembly lines, if your family was part of that 1 million volunteers who defeated Japan through anonymous industrial excellence, tell their story, share their name, make sure they're remembered, because Dorothy Miller's 847,000 inspected rounds matter. Every single one. Patricia McCarthy's 8,400 fuel tanks matter. Think about the scale of that. Your family's contribution matters. Share it below. Let's preserve these names. Together.